that's the title of my paper today. That's my name, and I'm on Twitter as well, under @Helen Barcham. Okay, so on my flight from Australia to Europe, I was sitting beside a man who struck up conversation with me, and upon monopolising the armrest and most of my personal space, he asked as he peered over at my laptop and at this slide what this actually meant. And as I put it to him and as I'll put it to all of you, so today I'll be talking to you about therapy culture. I'll define that a little later on. But specifically I'll be talking about the tangled, complicated, love-hate relationship that therapy culture has with feminism. I'll be talking about how therapy culture's individualising idiom is transforming political subjectivities and forms of selfhood. And since we know that self-perception has a significant effect on behaviour, it can be said then that therapy culture is directly influencing, shaping and mobilising political action. And so that's really what's at stake for my research. And so to make this claim, I'll be looking at everyday sexism as a case study. So knowing as we do that the political ambitions of feminism were and continue to be wide-ranging, to basically talk about the state of contemporary feminism today, there's a lot in that. And so what I will be focusing on is really the public, the organisation of life into the public-private nexus. The reason I have chosen this and to track that from second wave to contemporary feminism is because it has long been a site of contestation for feminism, and frankly, it's also been a site of triumph. Okay, so I'm going to get a bit theoretical here, and then I'll try and pace that out. So I'll start by talking a bit about the political imaginaries of second wave feminism. So, in the highly politicised culture of the 1960s and 1970s, second wave feminists argued that the public-private divide was repressive in nature and function because the purportedly natural assignment of women to the private room seemed to legitimate their exclusion from social and political life. Identifying women with a naturalistic private sphere rendered them publicly invisible and deprived them of their civil liberties. Feminists then fought to dismantle this gendered categorisation via two grounds, which are here. So firstly, what they tried to do was they sought to politicise the political. Sorry, that was my second point. So firstly, they sought to increase the visibility of women into public life, and secondly, they sought to politicise the political by arguing that the private constitutes a sphere of social relevant needs, not a bundle of natural aptitudes and dispositions. And they trumpeted the slogan, "The personal is the political." And by doing this, they successfully expanded the boundaries of contestation beyond social economic distribution to include things like housework, reproduction, sexuality. And so what this meant was, consequently, the problem with no name, which was previously characterised as isolated and individual, was now recognised as a social systemic struggle, predicating a collective identity for women as women, and enabling a politicised interpretation of needs to enter the public discourse and the agenda of the welfare state. And what this did was it promised to invoke a gender-sensitive revision of democracy and justice. So now that was second wave. Now what I want to do is fast forward 50 years and see where are we today and what have we done with these political ambitions. So, a look at various social and cultural sites signal that there's a new trend on the rise. Increasingly, high-powered women and men are publicly and unabashedly espousing feminism. Whether it's Beyonce performing to millions of viewers at the Video Music Awards against the word feminist, or actress actress Patricia Arquette advocating the abolishment of the gender pay gap during her Oscar speech. It cannot be denied that what we are witnessing is a mainstreaming of feminism. And of course, the internet has arguably played a key role in facilitating this mainstreaming, giving, for example, a rise to feminist spaces through blogs such as Feministing and Everyday Sexism, and at the same time enabling a cross-fertilisation of feminist communication and networks across space and time. And I must put it out there, of course, I'm not, suggesting that the internet or the online world is some kind of feminist utopia. Of course, as people mentioned earlier and all day, that it is quite rife with anti-feminist sentiment. Okay, so this brings me to my case study, Everyday Sexism. So who here has heard of Everyday Sexism? Oh, good. Okay, so I don't really need to get into this too much, but I just want to make a few comments. So the campaign was initially established as a website, and within the first year of its inception was rolled out to 17 countries. And Everyday Sexism has, as popular things do in a digitally mediated world, syndicated into various social media platforms and also into book form. And the campaign, for those of you who don't know, the campaign is founded on basically creating a catalogue of personal anecdotes from women across the globe about their everyday encounters with sexism in a bid to, as the website reads, foreground to the world that sexism does exist, it is faced by women every day, and it is a valid problem to discuss. So a few things to note about everyday sexism. Women submitting their stories can choose to do so anonymously or under their name. I've played around with this a few times and put in ridiculous things, and it works. And posts are moderated by Laura Bates and her team. And there's actually no character limitation to the text box, which means that the architecture of the website doesn't actually impinge upon the detail or the length or the detail of the post. So consequently, what you see is that the posts are quite long in detail, and for that specific reason, I'm unfortunately not able to show you more than one example today. Okay, so this is a post by Jay. The rationale of choosing this post was when I was putting the slides together, it was the top post, so I just snipped that out. I'll give you 30 seconds to have a read of what it says, and I'll do some discussion on it. Is everyone done? Okay, so I'll discuss this now, and I'm bringing back that whole public-private discussion. So, in a digitally mediated world, the partition between the public and private is arguably dissolved, as technologies such as the mobile phone invoke an intersection of worlds, and as the public sphere becomes saturated with exposure of private life. I think a really good example of that is the Caitlyn and Bruce Jenner thing, that we're entitled to this person's story and they've got to come out and tell us everything. So through the widespread publicising of private matters via acts of confession, a therapeutic sensibility premised on emotionalisation has become one of the dominant ways in which actors express, shape and understand themselves and society. And this is evidenced, for example, in these celebrity tell-all interviews and like that is pretty much everywhere. So the blurring of the public and private and the emotional term is, according to sociologists such as Eva Illouz and Frank Ferruti, a manifestation of and tribute to therapy culture. And so what exactly is therapy culture? Well, it's marked by the spill of the therapeutic ethos from clinical spaces in which it emanated into everyday institutions, vernaculars, and structures. So therapy culture manifests itself, for example, in the self-help books that, plague our bookstores. It's in our everyday language, in us saying things like, who's going through a midlife crisis, or she seems anxious. It's pretty much everywhere. And now what I'll argue is it's also starting to inform the way we do activism. So back to everyday sexism. So the effective makeup of everyday sexism, the fact that it relies on therapeutic techniques of confession and emotionalism as the basis of its activism, appears at first glance to carry second-wave feminism's ambitions of politicizing the personal. So no doubt what everyday sexism has done is it's created discursive spaces for women to share their personal pains and for these to enter the public sphere, thus invoking Lauren Ballard's notion of intimate publics. Here, women across the globe form community through mutual affective ties. In this case, it's a collective suffering of sexism. And the 80,000 testimonials collected by the campaign worldwide have allowed for a resurgence of public discussion and social reflexivity around sexism. Also, what everyday sexism has done is it has mobilised, it's offered a feminist vocabulary to its actors, so people know what to hashtag. And this, as Maria Marcus tells us, is a necessary tool for public participation. But at the same time that the therapeutic rationality has mobilised these opportunities for feminism and the feminist subject, a problematic coexistence of tenacious post-feminist challenges also exist. So I borrow the term, Angela McRobbie's term, double entanglement, to basically signify this weird kind of coexistence whereby inequality and diminished solidarity coexist with heightened awareness of social discrimination. So theorist Swan tells us that at the heart of therapy culture is the idea that the psychological self, as opposed to the physical self or the social self, or wider society, is the source of the problems and the main resource for providing potential solutions to these problems. Now, this way of framing problems and solutions is evident in the post by Jay here. Although Jay acknowledges that a culture of victim blaming exists, her solution is not one of social modification, rather it's a personal one. So what she's done is saying that she's given up drinking and she's going to make smarter choices. And so what we see here is a rhetorical reframing of sexism that is personalised and isolated rather than thematic and systematic. The feminist subject, in this instance Jay, translates sexism from a structural problem to an individual affair, thus cultivating an imperviousness to the role of social, cultural and economic forces in producing inequalities, and therefore espousing the therapeutic rationality which renders the life of the individual as a private matter. And so to conclude, what I want to say is what we are witnessing is feminism, a movement once dedicated, however problematically, to concepts of solidarity and collectivism, being framed in extremely individualistic terms. And what we're seeing is this is spawning an aggregation of individual selves in a supposedly collective environment. And what I'd like to say is that should feminism continue this dangerous liaison with the therapeutic, with the individualist idiom, it'll mobilise a world where once again the individual will become the site to which societal problems are raised and where it will be perceived they need to be resolved. Thus, what we will witness is a depoliticising of the political and potentially an undoing of the victories of second wave feminism. Okay, that was all.
Next up we have Stephen on eGirls, or what's Ophelia doing on social media?
Do I just leave my presentation on this?
I guess so.
She isn't.
Hi everyone. So Lena Dunham seemed appropriate for a conference with girls' culture as a theme. There's something that came across in an interview that she drew reflecting on the popularity of the hit HBO series, her own hit HBO series. And she noted the intersections between Shakespeare and girls' culture. It's just one of many of the intersections of Shakespeare and girls' culture. And it's interesting to think that she used the adjective Shakespearean. It serves to valorise the show via recourse to Shakespeare's cultural authority. And we can think of the ways in which Shakespeare's plays provide many examples of girls or young women on the cusp of adulthood. Catherine Driscoll notes that the canonical position of Shakespeare as an index of Western culture can suggest the retrospective construction of modern girls via available representations of girls in the past. And we can think about the rich citational afterlives of plays, how that enables them to be formative to the cultural construction of girlhood. I was going to suggest when we think about girls who might, in Shakespeare, we'd probably think of Juliet or Ophelia, and Ophelia is the subject or the focus of my paper. Most likely because Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet remain have a high cultural visibility due to the curriculum and due to the film industry and so forth. But social media platforms are also contributing to the visibility of Shakespearean texts, and Ophelia is in particular marks a kind of cultural phenomenon. The iterations of Ophelia on social media are an interest in Shakespeare studies and in girls' culture too. And to arrive at what Ophelia might mean in that context or these contexts is to think about a set of stories. That Ophelia is in many ways the story of representation in Elaine Showalter's important essay on that character in Hamlet. And to just think for a moment about Ophelia's story in Hamlet, that it's largely one of her secondariness, and that her love for the young prince, his rejection of her, this leads ultimately to her drowning. Ophelia is the object of Gertrude's poetic description, which memorialises a young girl, and she becomes the floating girl who is denied the agency of suicide. In Gertrude's phrase, she is one incapable of her own distress. And so it's where Ophelia's story begins, but it's also in a sense where that story ends. Shakespeare is said to haunt modern culture, yet it's a different Shakespeare that returns, or that is repeated, the return of the expressed, as Marjorie Garber adroitly puts it. By contrast, Ophelia's modern ghosts appear somewhat homogenous and even somewhat predictable, and the iterations of Ophelia that I've noticed in social media tend to repeat that familiar story, that it becomes a story of representation. Ophelia is also about context, her cultural afterlife being well documented, and she continues to supply a metaphor for cultural representations of girls. Ever since Millet's 1852 painting, she has signified an ideal of femininity and of beauty. And historically too, Ophelia represents regulated female sexuality and the spectralization of female death. With the publication in 1994 of Mary Piper's popular psychology study, Reviving Ophelia, She has denoted the teenage girl in crisis and the girl hostile culture of the media more generally. So no, we're longer dealing with the character in Hamlet, although the imprimatur of Shakespeare is probably indirectly operational. So one can go as far as to suggest that Ophelia signifies a discourse that names and constitutes the contemporary girl. Jennifer Hulbert talks about the Opheliazation of the teenage girl. And even a cursory search in social media platforms substantiates that claim. There's a proliferation of Ophelias on YouTube, on Pinterest, on Tumblr, just to take 3 examples of social media platforms, that can be seen as a continuation of an Ophelia discourse. My question this afternoon is anything new occurring here? That's an important question to ask. So there's an aggregation of Ophelias on social media that arguably it does constitute a novel development, since these platforms reflect new scales of distribution and connectivity for vernacular or amateur productions. So Ophelia then becomes an instance of the prosumer girl, the media user as both consumer and producer of media content. And that continuum, I think, alerts us to the potentiality of Ophelian discourse, but also of its limits. So we encounter a bewildering array of content that suggests user agency, yet find it to be marked by repetition. We encounter seemingly democratic, dynamic media making, but find its hallmarks are more often about surface and brand, and this even where irony is deployed. So again, is Ophelia a progressive text? And it's necessary then to think about the return to the repetition of Ophelia and what that might reveal about girls' culture. Ophelia can be seen as something of a cultural phenomenon, as I mentioned, but I think it's also important to attend to the specificity of the iteration. So we're talking about a YouTube Ophelia, a Pinterest Ophelia, a Tumblr Ophelia. These are all instances of spreadable media, but they do carry their own context, perhaps even their own ideologies. So just want to take an example then of the YouTube Ophelias from Ophelia's blogs. Oh, that shouldn't have happened.
Oh, that's okay. You can just press the little play button.
You just click
Or
there.
yeah, right there.
All right,
Yeah.
okay, thanks for that. So I won't play all of this, just take an example.
So my brother Laertes is leaving, and he was getting so emotional. Like, I can kind of understand it, you know, like how when your family's like, you know, and stuff like, you know, I don't know, they just act like they care too much, you know? And so he was like telling me all about how I should live my life like I was like, hold it, I don't know. And it was about Hamlet too, and like, I know that he's like rich and fancy and all, but that doesn't mean we can't be in love, right? Like, how can Laertes tell me who to be with? He thinks he's like in charge of me, and it's like so annoying. Anyways, so like he's like, well, whatever.
So I'll just pause it there for a moment. So we have here from a video from 2012, it's with 190 views at the time when I was just thinking about it, a Barbie type Ophelia with visual cues to Marilyn Monroe, films like Clueless and Mean Girls, delivers her digest to the webcam. And Ophelia then becomes a number of images and text to be adapted within YouTube's culture of creative appropriation and mashup. So we get 5 logs in this video. Ophelia updates the viewer on her relationship status, and the subtitles separate the video diaries, which are further individuated through physical adjustments, so the blonde hairstyle becomes more distressed looking as Ophelia has unfolding revelations. We have in the background Rick Astley's 1980 pop factory hit, Never Gonna Give You Up, and later as Hamlet is seen as less than reliable, we have Avril Lavigne's Happy Ending. This takes on an ironic twist. And I think the pop references seem deliberately outdated, as if implying that this particular Ophelia is not tuned into contemporary girl culture. Now, of course, the video is explicitly referencing, perhaps parodying the vlog, a genre of self-expression that predates YouTube. And importantly, it instances, or can be seen in correlation to Teresa Seneff's argument in Can Girls, that the webcam, the humble webcam, becomes a vital means to speak back to the new media industry. In adapting the vlog and uploading it to YouTube, the videographer partakes in the staple genre of YouTube culture and the invitation of the websites and the trademark strapline to broadcast yourself. And it enacts Bolter and Grusin's influential study, their concept of remediation, so that the new medium authenticates itself in relation to earlier technologies of representation. In this instance, we have the vlog that's remediating the Shakespearean soliloquy, appropriating its form and dispersing it through the video distribution platform. So the young performer in Ophelia's vlog simultaneously finds an online alias, in a sense becoming Ophelia, and also replaces the older technology of representation that is Shakespeare's character. And in this instance, I think remediation becomes a return to history, to Ophelia as a text of girlhood, but also a turn away from her in the pursuit of a new expression of the girl. The video has an accompanying description where the producer notes we explored Ophelia's character in relation to teenage girls, using the book Reviving Ophelia by Mary Piper. So it situates itself in relation to that aforementioned popular psychology study, where Ophelia is used as a starting point for diagnosing the destructive forces that affect young women, as Piper puts it. And the overlaying of Piper's Ophelia with the Shakespearean character, arguably, as I've been suggesting, has a remedial function. In Jennifer Hulbert's terms, Piper and her followers save Ophelia from women despising perspective and depict her separate from Hamlet and his anger. And so, extricated from the patriarchal economy of Shakespeare's tragedy, Ophelia begins to signify anew. These young women become people in their own right, no longer part of that play and its gender politics. So there's been a lot of debate about Piper's book and the reviving Ophelia discourse, particularly in relation to its neoliberalism, and we've heard very interestingly about that this afternoon. I think it's also important to mention that this, in terms of its parody, in terms of its irony, the sense of play to it, the sense of performance to it. But as Catherine Driscoll argues in her important work on girls' culture, we need to interrogate the assumption that that culture is necessarily conformist, that play and performativity, in the sense that Judith Butler uses it, can have a politically productive, politically progressive dimension to it. So I just want to move on then to take some examples of other platforms. And to think about Pinterest and Tumblr and the visual dominance of these, or the dominance of the visual register in these. And again, we have the different categories that Ophelia might fall into: painting, overdose, art, Malay, photography, and so forth. And my question is, how are we to look at these? How are we to interpret these images? That these coaxing technologies, as Amy Morrison describes Pinterest and Tumblr, the way in which they coax the user into sharing, into producing, into making connections. There's a sense of a community, of an appearance of a network, but maybe only the appearance of one. And I'm interested in what the effective range or intensities of these images are as we scroll down and as the technology returns more and more content. That repetition compulsion that we might note in Ophelia, that it is the story of the representation and the construction of a certain version of femininity. There's a sense of history too, of the difference within the reception of Ophelia, and that there are specific representations to this figure, that we have a sense of history, a history lesson occurring in these images. But again, the repetition, the sense that we're seeing the same thing again and again, and that they're damaging representations of women, that it's the spectralization of female death, that there's a spectatorship at work here. How is the gaze working? It's difficult to say. So the reception context is crucial to interpreting the different Ophelias that are at work here and the implications of Ophelian imagery. As I suggested, there might be a progressive dimension in the sense that you can have a gender performativity, but also the use of irony and parody. And irony and parody become almost the dominant modes of social media, that it's as if irony is in free flow, that it doesn't have a critical edge anymore, that it doesn't generate an appropriate critical distance. We're dealing with pastiche. Particularly like this Tumblr post, the reflection on Ophelia's name, why aren't there more Ophelias? And the sense too that, OMFG Hamlet, like, feck off, kind of attitude, do I look like I care? A complete deconstruction of Malay's fetishization of Ophelia as the beautiful woman in death. So there's a difficulty for critics as we're noticing this material and how we interpret it. It's a question of attention and of a busy attention economy. What we notice, what we choose to notice, what we're interested in finding in searching through these different Ophelias. So girls might contest constructions of femininity through Ophelia. They're drawing on an existing data bank. The Shakespeare scholar Akane identifies repetition compulsion, and she importantly asks, as a feminist, I would prefer that Ophelia, in whatever media she lives on, be self-consciously performed, so that the girls do not drown with her, but rather wonder why, in the play world of Hamlet, her girlhood ends that way. And I've been suggesting that Ophelia is both an enabling and delimiting text for young women interested in participating online or producing content for that setting. So Kane's hope is for a self-conscious production of Ophelia, and it suggests that various forms of resistance might occur in such images on Tumblr. A resistance to Shakespeare as a touchstone of cultural parity, resistance to tradition, to normativity, to correctness, to the beauty industry and expectations about the female body, or to the cultural demands for a single unitary self. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Next up, we have Harvey and Kanai. Yeah. On the papers called What Should We Call Me? Authorship, Readership, and Diversity in a Feminine Digital Public.
In this paper, I want to discuss how, in some contexts, the acts of readership rather than authorship are key in connecting young women in a shared social digital imaginary. I use the example of a set of blogs on blogging social network Tumblr to point to sophisticated social literacy, which allows young women to become recognisable to each other in a context of sparse cues. The blogs, I suggest, require a literacy which is predicated on a classificatory imagination, founded on familiarity with middle-class youthful feminine culture in the West. So first, some background on the blogs. The blogs I refer to all offer anonymous, self-representative accounts of feminine experience. However, what's interesting about the blogs is how they narrate this experience, and the fact they're all inspired from one blog in particular called What Should We Call Me? So this is the blog here. What Should We Call Me was established in early 2012 on Tumblr and rapidly became well known for narrating relatable feminine moments through GIF reaction posts. So you can see this is the caption here, the situation, and the GIF provides the reaction. Garnering approximately 1 to 2 million views per day in the early days of the blog, What Should We Call Me inspired many imitations, including adaptations such as What Should Betches Call Me? And What Should We Call Plus Size? And the list goes on. Following Schiffman, this development might be understood as a meme, a unit of culture which spreads through imitation and adaptation. Understanding What Should We Call Me as a meme is significant because in a meme, authorship and readership are very close practices. The question of production of a text is less important than being in the know and getting the text itself. So back to here. Okay, the way these blogs have spread as a meme can be attributed in part to the location of the blogs on blogging social network Tumblr. As Van Zunen and others have commented, blogging has traditionally been theorised as an authorial practice quite separate to readership, whereby one writes oneself into being. Expanding upon what Reingold terms first wave blogging, Tumblr evinces a shift to norms of merged authorship and readership and to reproduction as production. So Tumblr arguably provides a context which facilitates memes in that What becomes important is not the question of who produces something, but how one recognises the narrative or the significance of it. Founded in 2007 and purchased by Yahoo in May 2013, Tumblr is a popular, fast-growing network or platform, boasting at least 325 million unique visits each month. So Tumblr provides allowances to follow one's favourite blogs and like blog posts, as well as publish posts oneself. However, the most common option for content creation on Tumblr is to simply reblog one's favourite posts produced by others. Similar to the share function on Facebook, Tumblr's reblogging function allows the user to reproduce their favourite posts on their own blog, so that others' attributed production becomes part of one's own production, like a scrapbook. So I just wanted to show you how that might happen. Okay, so I click on this. Okay, the reblog things don't seem to be coming up.
It's at the top on the right-hand side.
Oh, whoops. Oops. So it should come up at the top here when it's reblogged. Okay, I'm just going to keep on going. Okay, basically, according to Danielle Strello, who works in community management at Tumblr, about 95% of the content on Tumblr at any given time is made up of reblogged content. So based on Fink and Miller's work, I suggest that reblogging can be understood as a demonstration of connection to a particular idea or a social group. It's a demonstration of one's taste as a reader. Accordingly, the importance of the content on one's own blog is not that one authored it oneself necessarily, but that a sense of connection and discernment in relation to others is displayed. So this produces a culture, I suggest, which is conducive to the production of memes like What Should We Call Me? So when authorship and readership are proximate, social literacy becomes much more important. As Burgess points out, while literacy is a competency, it is also derived from a social system that values particular knowledges over others. So it's not just a self-evident thing that individuals can possess. Returning to this meme, I suggest there's a particular feminine digital literacy which is required for participation as a reader. Such literacy derives from a location within cultures of girlfriendship. Alison Winch suggests girlfriendship is an affective social relation saturated by larger cultural narratives of feminine commonality and post-feminist neoliberal normativity. So here I wish to foreground the way in which girlfriendship as a form of literacy operates to invite others to see or to share an understanding of subjectivity based on such an imagined feminine commonality. So as an example, take this post featuring Daenerys Targaryen from the television show Game of Thrones from one of the blogs. When someone I hardly know gives me unsolicited advice on my love life. So the juxtaposition of the GIF, appropriated from a pop culture context, with a simple situational caption, does not necessarily give rise to a meaning that's just out there and self-evident. One has to read the caption with the movement in the GIF together. So the reader has to understand that the GIF articulates the feeling associated with the caption in order to decode the punchline. And the feeling in question is supposed to be the feeling of the blogging author, but also the feeling that the reader might recognise as having had herself simultaneously. In the GIF, the reader has to appropriately construct what Daenerys, the figure on the horse, whose body articulates this feeling, is doing with the words, your opinion, through reading the expression of her face and the movement of her arm. Daenerys' position of power can be read through her position on a horse, associated with nobility. She's also notably leading a group of non-white men who are placed further in the background of the image. So she's in a position of kind of imperial power almost. She's contemptuously discarding rather than dropping the words. So I suggest that the lens of girl friendship assists in recognising what's happening, why Daenerys is discarding your opinion. The reader recognises that unsolicited advice, particularly in relation to young women's intimate life, is irritating, and that the blogger, as Daenerys, is haughtily discarding this unwanted advice. So that was sort of a long-winded explanation of something you usually take 2 seconds to get. But I just wanted to point to that there are a number of codes that have to be understood before the post can be deciphered. It's not necessarily vital to recognise the figure from Game of Thrones, but I suggest that the added knowledge, in addition to the knowledge of other cultural cues, can provide for a particularly rich construction of the social imaginary, which as a reader you're invited to try on. The literacy mobilised to read the post relates to a feminine world that is presumed to be shared and identified with. So this presumption of a recognisable shared feminine knowledge comes through more clearly in this post by WhatShouldWeCallMe. When I have to wear a bathing suit for the first time this summer. The I being understood to be feminine. The first image here, expectation, is occupied the body of a slim, white, busty young woman who is enormously beautiful and who preens in a stripy bikini. And the reality GIF, which is laid out for contrast, features a young, bare-chested, chubby man. And wincing, he says, "I'm just a fat piece of shit." This blunt, hyperbolic expression of self-loathing instrumentalizes bodies which cite entrenched and understood notions of idealized femininity. So the body in the second GIF is used as shorthand to signal a type of disgust with its patent lack of fit within a feminine bodily ideal. So not only must readers be able to adopt this girl friendship lens to access this social imaginary, they must also be able to understand the way these narratives are delivered through classification. The self here is narrated through division and classification into generic moments of life experience for circulation through Tumblr's reblogging and liking functions. So the way in which the blogs are built on producing oneself in distributable moments speaks to the form of classificatory digital literacy that WhatShouldWeCallMe readers must possess. David Beer argues that scholars need to develop a stronger sense of the classificatory imagination, which is key to contemporary infrastructures of participation in digital cultures. Beer draws on the Foucauldian idea of the archive, once a state-located apparatus of productive disciplinary power, which now, Beer suggests, become more diffuse and decentralised. So classification is now central to social participation in digital contemporary culture, with individuals now taking on the work of documenting and monitoring in ways which produce certain subjectivities and ways of belonging. So I suggest that this form of classification may also coincide with contemporary feminine practices in a post-feminist context where monitoring and documenting the self becomes part of one's form of self-government. Accordingly, on one level, girl friendship literacy is informed by post-feminist practices of subjectivity. Being able to monitor the self and segment minute episodes in one's life becomes a way of understanding a social feminine narrative, which is parcelled out accordingly. So on a second level, post-feminism becomes a resource with which to understand and recognise figures and situations which come through in these classifications. So what I want to highlight is not simply that classification of the self is being done, but that it becomes a lens with which to read the narratives put forward by participants in digital cultures, as they do here. So the moments in the What Should We Call Me texts are organised and produced through such forms of documenting, recording and listing, using figures of the post-feminist imagination to cite feminine experiences and things understood as common. So the when, which usually prefaces the situational caption of the posts, indicates the work of general classification. So, oh no, that was a good one. Go. Alright, so when my boyfriend starts to let himself go. Okay. When I see some chick getting all flirty with my crush. When I can see that my friend has been on Instagram but hasn't answered my text. So the blogs accordingly distill and use recognisable figures of girlfriendship to facilitate readership in a digital setting by unknown others with few other cues. The reader uses a girlfriendship literacy to gain access to this classificatory moment with anonymous figures. And given that the original What Should We Call Me blog has inspired others to start their own similar blogs, I suggest that the texts have a certain address to the reader, which asks them to reflect upon how they recognise themselves in these moments. The blogs accordingly actively ask the reader to use their own classificatory imaginations to reflect on how they might similarly fit into a feminine world. So these blogs, which appear relatively simple, demonstrate a sophisticated literacy which draws on post-feminist ways of understanding the self. We might conclude that the documenting, monitoring, classificatory impulse of post-feminism forms an important part of the social literacy here. This does not mean that the practices of authorship and readership here are purely post-feminist. Indeed, the ability to use one's classificatory imagination to draw absurd associations together can describe much of internet-based humour, you might argue. But my point is that arguably both readers and authors might equally belong in this sort of digital culture, and that in the What Should We Call Me meme, one must be literate in an understanding of feminine culture, including post-feminist practices and classifications to enable entry.
For the last half of the day, we have Tisha and Turk talking about technology, community, and the history of knitting.
Okay, so I'm talking about vidding. If I say vidding, do people know what that means? Raise your hand if you've seen a vid, or if you know that you've seen a vid. Okay, so some high hands, some sort of ambivalent wiggling hands. Now I'm going to show you a part of a vid in a minute. So for those of you who haven't seen one, you will get that particular joy. So for those of you who don't know what vidding is, let me give you a little bit of context, a sense of what you're going to be seeing. So a vid is repurposed audio plus repurposed video. It's taking clips from film or TV and setting them to a song to do something, right? And what that something is can vary. Francesca Coppa, who is probably the premier person working on the history of vidding, talks about vids as visual essays that stage arguments. And I think there are things to argue with about that definition, but it's a pretty good starter. Some of the different things that vids can do, they can celebrate a show. They can say, this is my favorite character, this is my favorite show, I love it so much, here's why I love it. Look at how great it is. It can interpret a character. This is a character's motive at a particular moment in this series. Refocus, say, I'm gonna take the James Bond movies and I'm gonna make a vid that's about a minor character, that's about Judi Dench's Anne, for example. Or I'm going to critique the show. I'm going to say, you know what, I love the TV show Supernatural, but let's talk about how misogynist and racist it is. That's a problem, even though I love the show. Or otherwise subvert the show in some way. So there are a lot of different positions, but these are all, in some ways, made from a place of love, right? If you don't love, or if you aren't emotionally invested in the TV show or the film, you're not going to spend the time that it takes to do all the work to make this thing. So let me show you a little bit of a short vid. So this is from the Star Trek reboot movie. This was made in 2009.
The only moves I see tonight will be made up on the garment. Elephants make it understood, it ain't no good if there's too much wood. Make sure you know before you go the dance floor, no ratio. 5 to 1 is a rodeo, tells me that I can start to go. Without signing, not so far, 20 dudes in a common line. Too many dicks on the dance floor. Easy to fix. Spread out the dicks. Too many dudes with too many dicks. Too close to my shit, too hard to eat chicks. I need better, need more blood, less fun. I can't even battle.
All right, we'll stop there. I think you have a sense of the thesis statement of this vid. My students, who many of whom have never seen vids before, I say, what is the thesis statement of this vid? And they're like, not enough ladies, too many mans. Yes, that's it, exactly. You've seen my devious, plan. Okay, so vids are great. I love them. Why are they important? Why do they actually matter? Why should I be talking to you about them? I think a couple of reasons. Well, lots of reasons. There are so many reasons that I write about this extensively, but one is that vidding is really pretty important to the history of remix, or it could be understood as important to the history of remix, and it doesn't get talked about very much. The other is that vidding is interesting as a genre that is very much by women for women, and this is something that when I think I can say that here and people won't freak out, but often when I'm at other kinds of conferences presenting on vids, someone, almost always a male someone, surprisingly, or not, will say, well, guys do this too, right? We're the men. Surely men do this. And I say, no, sweetie. I mean, some guys do. Not very many, though. I mean, the vidding conventions are, 99% women. And, guys are doing fan films and they're doing fan editing, but they're not making vids. And some people just sort of refuse to believe that there's an artistic genre that men aren't, super involved in. And this is different if we're talking about, for example, anime music videos, where there are a lot more men who've been involved. That's a form with a slightly different history. So one of the things that I think is interesting, maybe in the context of this symposium, is that the sort of popular misogyny that was talked about in the original call for papers isn't something that necessarily affects the production of vids. Vids are being produced by the thousands, many of them, right? You can't throw a rock on YouTube without hitting one of them. But popular misogyny does, I think, affect how vids are perceived, how they're interpreted. So there's an assumption that vids aren't serious, or they're not interesting, or they're not important, or they're not art. Or they are interesting or important to the extent that they conform to really familiar genres like parody. So something like Star Trek Dance Floor, or Luminosity's vid, Vogue, which takes the movie 300 and sets it to Madonna's Vogue, which is worth watching if you have any sense of humor at all. If it's like parody, if it's political critique, then it's interesting. But a lot of vids are relationship vids. They're vids about, I think these two characters love each other a lot. Or, I want to watch them kiss to my favorite song for 3 minutes. Or, I think these two characters should be together. And those kinds of celebrations of relationships, including queer relationships, are often seen as fluffy or pointless or mere entertainment, not as interesting. And I think they're really interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of vidding, because I think even people who have seen them often don't know much about sort of where vids came from in the pre-YouTube era. And this is a history that is starting to be documented academically. Francesca Coppa, who I mentioned before, is working on an oral history project and has a book forthcoming, partly spurred by real-world losses. Some of the bidders of the 70s and 80s have died recently from breast cancer or having health problems, and so there's a sense that we have to talk to these women, get some of their stories recorded before we lose them. But although that history is being documented academically, I think in some ways it's still not accessible to particularly girls and young women who are making these kinds of videos and who don't know anything about where the tradition came from. So, some of the themes I want to talk about in this history are production. How have vids been produced? How have they been distributed? Because these have changed over time. And what have some of the changes been in the community around vidding and the kinds of mentoring that goes on related to vidding? And there are several shifts that have happened here. A move from centralized to decentralized, from inaccessible information and inaccessibility of vids to being more accessible, and also a shift from mentoring relationships to more sort of horizontal social relationships. So how these things play out. I'm giving a super broad overview of the history here for the sake of time, so this is not super nuanced, but we can think about sort of four main eras in the history of vidding. And the first is when vidding first begins. Actually in 1975, Candy Fong made the first vid, which was actually a slideshow made with frames of Star Trek from the cutting room floor. They're slideshows, they're shown at fan conventions. It was a sort of performance art. Candy actually had to take her slide carousel and set it up on a slide projector and stand there, right? So someone's hit play on the cassette player, and then she would, in time with the music, change the slides. And later she realized if she had two slide carousels, she could sort of do one and then the other, and you could do a cross dissolve, which is amazing. And we have records of these because in the 80s, some of her slideshows, which she was still doing, were actually videotaped. So we do have some records of those, and a few of them have been posted online and at Transformative Works and Cultures. There are a couple of them available. So that's the very earliest stuff, and then starting at the very end of the 70s into the 80s and really through the 90s, you have VCR editing. And remember, this is when VCRs were super expensive. And especially if you need two of them, right? One to play and one to record. And so women were often at this point bidding in collectives. They were pooling their money to buy VCRs. And you didn't necessarily have them or both of them at your house, and so people would sort of travel to each other's houses to collaborate on these things. And vids were distributed at that point mostly on VHS tape, usually at conventions, sometimes by mail. But you sort of had to know the secret handshake, right? You couldn't just encounter vids in the wild. You had to see them at a convention, or somebody had to go to a convention and get a tape and bring it back and show it to you in one of your living rooms. And if you wanted to learn to vid, very few people just sort of said, I want to do that. Most people were taught to vid by somebody. So you can talk about all the people that Mary Van Dusen taught to vid, or all the people that Sandy and Rach in the Seattle area taught to vid. And there are very sort of specific aesthetic trends that you can see in terms of where people learn to do this. Moving then into computer vidding, and around, in the early 2000s, you start to see people editing on computers, vids being distributed via online downloads, and people communicating via mailing lists. And so as this happens, we start to see that decentralizing that I was talking about. You can find vids on your own. You can say to yourself, hey, I have iMovie on my computer. I'll do something like this. And then the last big change in the mid-2000s is streaming distribution, right? Where vids can now spread way beyond the original poster. They can, people can encounter them on YouTube, they can reblog them on Tumblr, they can sort of travel in all sorts of different ways and be shared in different ways. And you also start to get people posting tutorials about how to vid, or how to do particular effects, or how to do certain kinds of coloring that people do. So information is available in a lot of different places. there have been some changes since then, you know, people using different platforms to publicize or to redistribute, but that is in some ways sort of still where we are. So I think there's some interesting things to think about in terms of how the community has changed because of the different technologies that people are using to make and to distribute vids. There are far lower barriers to entry now than there were in, say, the mid-'80s. There's a lot more access to vids themselves, to information about vids, to the ability to vid, right? If everybody has, you know, some sort of video software on their laptop. And we see now in a lot of ways demographic changes. You know, in the 80s, people who were vidding were mostly in their 20s, 30s, 40s. Now people are vidding in their teens, right? 12-year-olds are making amazing things and putting them on YouTube. So we see women, and often very young women, being empowered as individual creators, which I think is great. At the same time, the sheer amount of stuff out there has really changed the signal to noise ratio. So there's enormous amounts of information, but how do you find it? How do you even know where to start looking for it? And I think that's especially true of things about the history of vidding, right? You can find vids, how do you find out where vids came from? That's actually harder. And because partly of that signal to noise ratio, we have the problem of you don't know what you don't know. Vids have always been there, and they've always been like this. I think especially for people for whom VCRs are sort of literally unimaginable, who would say, well, clearly this came from people making vids onto VCRs. That's not intuitive, right? I think of my 18-year-old students who have maybe seen a VCR because their parents haven't thrown theirs away yet. They never, you know, used one. Why would you do that? That's just crazy. And so part of the effect of all of this is that the network of communication about vids and of instruction around vids hasn't really scaled up to match the number of women who are making vids and the number of women who are watching vids. And you know, I think we could say, well, why is this important? I mean, young women are making vids, so you know, who cares how they're communicating about it? But one of the things that sort of troubles me about that lack of mentoring and about the change in community around this practice is that knowing vidding history is part of what makes you part of an artistic community and not just a social community, right? And so I think this goes back to some of the things that Helen was saying in her presentation around women seeing things as individual issues versus shared issues. Social change happens when women see their issues as shared rather than as individual, and I think that you know, the status quo is maintained when women stay isolated, and this is part of a much bigger pattern around women's creativity that we can see across lots of different media, right? My background is as a literary critic and a rhetorician, so I think of, you know, early novelists, and you know, if we lose the history of the scribbling women of the 18th century, it's kind of hard to get that back. And I think that's true of remix as well, that if we don't know our history and if we don't communicate about that history and share that history, it's you know, we have this amazing tradition of female production in sort of non-ideal circumstances for 40 years, and losing that history is really a loss to feminist media. So even though I would never be nostalgic for the era of having to make vids on 2 VCRs, that was terrible. We don't want to go back to that. I think there is something about women's access to each other and women's instruction and the community that formed around that, pieces of which have been lost. And I don't have a solution to that, but I think it's worth thinking about. When we think about access, what goes with mere technological access, and what goes with floods of information and certain kinds of availability. What do we gain? What do we lose? So that's what I got.
I think we have 5 minutes?
Yeah, about 5 or so minutes for
5
questions.
minutes for some questions from the presenters. Don't be shy. What's the other question? I can ask questions.
At the end of the day, everyone gets sleepy. It was a really interesting panel, though. All the papers were really great.
I really like that last point that you made, Tisha, about the difference between a shared social history, where a shared social practice versus a shared artistic practice, and the need for documenting historicizing those activities, and I was wondering if you saw some parallels in terms of the everyday sexism, and if generally, if you guys had some thoughts on like the role of the archive, the role of historicization in feminist practices. Open question, but I was kind of targeting it at you.
Can you say that again? So
Yeah, just that last point that Tisha was making about the distinction between, I mean, you can say it if you wanted to, because you did a better point. I was trying to write it down at the same time as keeping time. What distinguishes a social practice from an artistic practice is a shared history. Is that like summarizing?
Yeah, like a shared awareness of that history,
Yeah.
right? Knowing where what you do came from, not just, sort of hanging out with your friends and doing it, but having some sense of being self-consciously a women's community or a feminist artistic community.
Do you think one day the Everyday Sexism Project will stand as like some sort of archive? Like, is there an archival function to these kinds of activities?
I have no idea. I really need to think about that.
I'm definitely not an expert on everyday sexism, but I actually have submitted stuff to it. And actually for me, looking through the records of what people have said has been like really useful for me almost to gauge the tenor of what you would submit. And to me it is interesting to go back and see like, the continuities of what women have been sifting through. Yeah.
To me, that was actually one of the really interesting things about the slide that you showed, because I think your point was so spot on that the way that poster is framing her experience is as very individual and not connected to other women's experience. But I think for people reading and seeing those threads that run through so many posts again and again, I sort of wonder if that could be a consciousness raising thing to say, oh, it's not just me. It's all of us. It's an us, right?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky thing, like if you look at the infrastructure of the actual website, because you can go on and you can read it, and then when you start to type, that kind of that whole typing experience is actually quite isolated. And like I said, because there's no character limitations, a lot of them just become kind of like a rant or a stream of consciousness where people get lost and they're just like offloading, and that's kind of distances you from everything else that's on there.
So it's serial monologues rather than a dialogue.
Yeah.
And that makes me think about Tumblr and the way that people use reblogging on Tumblr to add commentary and chime in and to connect with comments and not just the original post. That there's a different, even though in some ways Tumblr is terrible for facilitating conversation, there is sort of a record of people responding to each other, and on everyday sexism there's
Well, on Twitter, it's much different. Like everyday sexism and how that comes to play on Twitter because of the infrastructure there. You can see what's being retweeted that pops up, you can reply, and you actually get to see the profile of the person that's submitting. So obviously I couldn't focus on the whole thing because across different mediums it's different, but I would say that it's much more isolated on the website than it is.
I actually have a question now to follow up. Sorry, I'm just shouting out because Alison, I just see the back.
Sorry.
No, it's not your, I was just like, I just thought of something. No, it's quite interesting because I'm actually working on a project about everyday sexism as well. Are you interviewing, sorry I came in a bit late. Are you interviewing anyone in relation to the project, like women that are like posting, or are you just doing like a textual analysis?
Just a textual analysis at this point.
Because it's quite interesting because we found, so we're trying to talk, well, this is actually kind of a really important issue because to do this kind of digital media studies work, it's really hard to kind of talk to people. But the people we're able to talk to, which in the case of everyday sexism has been the volunteers and organizers and a few people who have used the site, they actually talk about it as a very kind of a practice of solidarity with other kind of women, like kind of contributing their stories, which is quite a very different narrative than just kind of doing a textual analysis. Anyways, I was just going to put that out there if you were interviewing people, because I think, sometimes we read a media text in one way, and then there's a very different response that the people that are, participating have.
Yeah.
and how that might kind of fit in with your analysis. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud here.
Yeah, I guess I'm at the early stages,
Uh-huh.
but I mean, I kind of want to look at it from that user perspective, and so a few times I've gone on and posted things, and it's, you literally go on, you type, you post, you may see your post pop up, and then it's, you read others, but my experience anyway hasn't been, like you can't reply to people, you can't connect with them, do you know what I mean? It's just there. So.
Yeah, no, I think your point about the architecture of the site is really interesting. Like, that's really useful to think about in terms of shaping the kinds of dialogue, or lack of dialogue, I guess, in this case.
Yeah, I mean, if you read a post and it really hit home to you and you wanted to contact that person that wrote it, how would you do that? I wonder. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
well, that's the problem with actually trying to get people to do interviews, because how do you can't contact the people, right?
Yeah.
So usually we tweet to people, or we post to Facebook or whatever. But yeah, that's a challenge with this site, because there's no actual way to get in touch, and then there's this kind of moderation.
Yeah, well, I meant as actually as a user, not as a researcher. So say you read something and
Right.
something really hit home,
Yeah.
and someone's got the same kind of suffering or whatever, and you want to engage with them further. There's,
Like on Twitter, you can direct message them or
you
whatever.
can. You can follow them. You can read their timeline even if you don't engage with them. So it's kind of just, they're just kind of there, but they're not really there.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Thank you.
I have a similar question to Stephen about the methods that you are thinking of
Yeah, in terms of
in order to understand this
yeah, that it was something I
phenomena.
didn't really get to do in the papers, that classic thing where you don't do what you say, you outline the abstract, the very thing it's meant to do. That sense of, that difficulty of pinpointing the kind of identities, the identity of the user. So the example of the YouTube video, we can see the young performer, I contacted her for the book I did on YouTube. I made contact with her and got permission to talk about that, where I didn't get permission from the video maker, where they featured themselves in the video. I didn't talk about those videos in terms of kind of human subjects and the interests of kind of research ethics. And doing some of this material in seminars, one of the students was saying about, we were looking at Ophelia on YouTube and the videos where you get that genre of the kind of like a fan video, the slideshow video, and it's kind of memorialization of her. And one of the students said, how do you know that's not some 40-year-old guy in his bedroom creating that? And then, produces those kind of reactions of people who go, not sure what I'm dealing with here now, it becomes a bit creepy. And it's something that I'm still trying to work with in terms of looking at the different platforms as well, because it does make Ophelia a kind of girl-damaging image potentially, and it's back, I think, to the kind of scoffophilia that one would associate with Millet's painting, and to an extent with maybe Ophelia as she's constructed within Hamlet, Shakespeare's play. So there's certainly a dilemma, I suppose, for the researcher, who's also then a user of these sites, and the deeper you go into them, you start then to look for, I suppose, things that you feel are outside of a particular pattern. And there's some examples of kind of drag Ophelia, but you have to go very far down, in terms of the clicks through on YouTube, the pages, to get to those. There's a sense that predominantly the search returns a sameness.
Do we have time for one last question? Or
Does
no?
anyone have one last question?
Was that a question or just a?
Was sort of.
One quick last question. You came all the way from Australia, New Zealand. New Zealand.
Even
My apologies.
further.
I know. Even farther. So ask away.
First of all, I wanted to just say really quickly that you did an excellent job of explaining Tumblr, because I've had to try and explain it to my mom like 1,000 times and draw diagrams and she doesn't get it. So I thought you did it really succinctly, which I can never seem to put my brain into those words. So that was really great. But I also had a question about the Ophelia talk. Have you looked, or did you find anything much about like a kind of things running together in terms of like the glorification of suicide or the glorification of like mental health issues with young women with Ophelia?
Yeah, certainly, that's a really good question, and it's certainly there in YouTube videos, and especially in the comments then below videos, and you get into sometimes very kind of difficult subject matters, and where videos are dedicated to, in terms of the construction but the narrative that accompanies the video, it's been structured, the reception context is set up in such a way that this is in homage to my friend who took their own life, and then you've comments about, which are often character focused, but become a way of talking about suicide ideation, and debates then flow out of that comment. Then you get trolls coming in kind of going, well, this is horrible what this person has done to themselves. So you do get into those issues, and I think it can be where Ophelia can be a remedial figure as well. There's that sense of where a difficult subject matter can be perhaps addressed in a classroom context through YouTube videos in ways that students might have an attenuated relation to the play. It's something that can be addressed more readily when you show a YouTube video, or where the comments then you kind of say, okay, this is what's going on within, and and then you can bring them back to the Shakespeare text. I suppose there's the risk that potentially the Shakespearean text looks as if it's valorizing suicide, and aestheticizing it as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, totally.
But it's certainly it's certainly a dimension of
Yeah.
Ophelia. It's certainly an important subtext. Yeah.
Well, I think that concludes our time, but we could all just give the conversation.
So anyone who wants to join us at the pub now will